Thank you, Jane. It's wonderful to accept your invitation to come speak, and thanks, Keone. And I look forward to Erica's lively moderation of the questions. And it's great to be back to the Liberty Forum. As Jane mentioned, it's been a while since I've spoken before you. I think it's been about 7 or 8 years. And I thought you guys were doing something wrong. If I was the first time the protesters ever showed up at your event, what were you guys doing wrong? I hope that since then you've had many, many protesters trying to disrupt all of your meetings, just as they did my last time with you. The great thing, I think, about my last visit was that I think the head of the forum then made sure that all the protesters paid the entrance fee and maybe even had to buy copies of my book. So I couldn't think of a better way to make sure that the protesters felt the pain that they were inflicting on the rest of us. It's also, it's really great. I wish I could be with you in person, and hopefully I can again in the future. I know this COVID epidemic has caused us to adopt these, I hope, short-term measures like appearing by Zoom and wearing no more handshakes, no more hugging, wearing masks that conceal our facial expressions, keeping 6 feet apart, staying inside and reading all the time and not getting outside and playing any organized sports. I like to say, now you know what it's like to grow up in a Korean family. Pretty soon you're all going to be bowing and using chopsticks like me. I hope this all comes to an end pretty soon, and by the springtime we'll be able to have meetings in person again. So what I'd like to do is just talk for about 20-25 minutes about my book, Defender-in-Chief, Donald Trump's Fight for Presidential Power, available at a bookstore near you, or better yet, make Jeff Bezos eat a lot of money to deliver it to your doorstep for free. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about that book, maybe take some questions, maybe talk about what could go wrong in the elections. I just had a piece online over the weekend about that, which several people who are here thought would be fun to talk about. And then let you all decide where our discussion goes. So let me start out by saying 4 years ago, I was not a supporter of President Trump's. I actually worried about what his effect on the Constitution would be. I thought that President Trump, as a populist, and he's certainly a populist, would follow in the footsteps of past populists. Populists always run into and strain against the Constitution because they see it often as an obstacle to fulfilling some kind of broad mandate. I sat down, I watched what happened over the last 4 years, and the first one to admit I was wrong. Boy, was I wrong. It's not Trump that actually, I think, poses the threat to the Constitution, but his opponents. And here I just went and looked at what people had published and said. It's his opponents, not Trump, that want to get rid of the Electoral College, the way we've chosen presidents for more than 220 years now. It's not Trump, it's his opponents who have said, we don't like the Supreme Court's outcomes. We're going to add 6 justices to the Supreme Court so that they're 15 now until it starts yielding to decisions that we want. It's not Trump, his opponents who want to create permanent independent counsels who will use the criminal law to fight our political battles. It's not Trump, it's his opponents who want to nationalize the energy industry, the transportation industry, all in favor of a vague Green New Deal, which will centralize control over large parts of our economy in Washington, D.C. It's not Trump, his opponents who say that federal law enforcement have invaded cities as an occupying force, when all they've done, I think, is try to restore some minimal law and order in the midst of these riots and disruptions. Nevertheless, it's his opponents who claim that's Trump who's a threat to the Constitution. It's hard to remember, but just a mere 8 months ago, our country was wrapped up in the ordeal of impeachment. Nancy Pelosi led a House of Representatives that did impeach President Trump on the grounds, as she put it, that he not become a king, that we have to restore the checks and balances of our Constitution. It's interesting, that's not the story you hear anymore. Nowadays, if anything, President Trump's opponents attack him for not using enough power, for not grabbing more presidential power in response to COVID. Sometimes you think they want him to take control of the entire economy, to decide to close and then to open every business in the United States, even though that's not the constitutional role of the president. So you could say, and my perspective might just be, look, the president has defended the Constitution just by making sure that the other side didn't take over and try to enact a revolution in our constitutional traditions and political practices going back centuries now. But I actually think Trump did more than just that. And I think if you take a step back and look at the things that really, on a day-to-day level, dominate the politics and the coverage of the presidency, take a step back, what was really going on, it seems to me, is that Trump was defending the prerogatives of his office, not just for him, but for his successors, so that a president can succeed in office rather than be doomed, in some ways as he was, to just unending political trench warfare that prevents any kind of positive agenda from proceeding. So take the Russia collusion investigation. And we all got wrapped up in, and we are still learning the details of how did the investigation get started. Was the use of the FISA electronic surveillance law valid? Why did Jim Comey and his top aides try to run this investigation out of FBI headquarters? Did Mueller conduct a fair investigation? And so on. But if you take a step back, what I think was really going on was a collision between our 18th century Constitution, which I think was represented by President Trump, and a grafted on progressive vision of what the Constitution should be, which I think was represented by Jim Comey and Bob Mueller. Let me explain why. In the Constitution, there are really two chief duties given to the president. The first is to protect the country's security. The second is to take care that the laws are faithfully executed, to enforce the laws. No one else in our system is given that duty, only the president. And so we've long understood since George Washington on that everyone else who works in this vast executive branch of government is constitutionally at the level of an assistant to the president who help him carry out the laws. But it's still the president who has to be in charge, who has to be able to control all of those subordinates, because he's the only one we as voters, as the people, actually elect. And so the framers' original idea, it's somewhat, I think, simple but important, was that we elect the president, and then the president controls all law enforcement at the federal level so that we can hold all those people politically accountable. Then around the turn of the last century comes along Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was governor of New Jersey, but before that, he had a much worse background. He was president of Princeton University, and worse than that, he was a political science professor. He had studied European theories of bureaucracy, and he wanted to bring them back to the United States. And his vision, which I think has had now much more influence on our world today than the original idea of our 18th century founders, was that government should be run by experts, by professionals, by technicians, that all these public policy questions we face, they're not really political questions, they're scientific questions. And if that's true, Wilson thought, then what you want is a government that's not under the control of politicians and those that we elect to serve. It should be as distant and insulated from politics as possible. And that's why I think that's what really was at stake in the Russia collusion fight. Remember when President Trump, I think properly, fired Jim Comey. Remember the explosion of outrage. How can the president fire the FBI director? Under the Constitution, it seems to me, under the 18th century Constitution, everyone, including the head of the FBI, including the Attorney General, and everyone on down, can be fired by the president. Now, that only plays to Trump's favorite line, right? His favorite management tool is, you're fired. But that actually is the tool that the founders thought would guarantee the ability of the president, and therefore the people, to control the way the government carried out the laws. Against that was the idea, oh, well, you'll have an FBI director. You'll have a special counsel like Mueller who will apply professional judgment to what are, I think, essentially political questions. And so in that fight between the special counsel and President Trump, you had this bigger constitutional struggle of our elected representatives to reestablish control over law enforcement rather than to allow people who'd never been elected to anything, like a Jim Comey, like a Bob Mueller, to say they had the professional judgment to decide better than the people who was fit or not fit to hold the office of the presidency. The second issue, of course, impeachment, has a similar story behind it. Again, it's an uprising by the bureaucracy. Instead of the FBI, this time it was the Foreign Service. Again, in the Constitution, the president is in charge of our foreign relations with other countries. No one else in the Constitution there's no mention of a Secretary of State. No one else, there's no cabinet members who are described in Article 2 of the Constitution. It's the president's responsibility. Everyone there who serves is an assistant to him. Yet, again, in the impeachment crisis, you look at the Ukraine crisis, what happened there? What happened was the Foreign Service, career bureaucrats, rose up and they said, we decide what the positions of the United States should be. We decide how foreign policy should be conducted. How can the president, they said, take issue with the findings of what they called the interagency process? I couldn't think of a better description of the progressive vision of government, that there should be an interagency process, which is superior to politics. And again, for good or ill, in terms of the way he did it or the style, what you had really in impeachment, what was going on behind impeachment, was the effort again of a president whom we elect, trying to reestablish political control over one of his constitutional duties, rather than to have it run by people who thought there's a professional, technical answer to everything, and we've got to get those dirty politicians as far away from policy as we can. Let me also point out, again, that President Trump has been anything but the ball in the china shop when it came to the Constitution, and that we can see through his relationship with the courts. One of the reasons I was an early skeptic of President Trump was because of the first travel ban. You may remember President Trump banned travel into the United States from 7, later 9 countries. The first 7 were all Muslim countries with an exception for Christians. I thought that was a violation of free exercise of religion. President Trump lost in district court. But what was important is President Trump then didn't keep saying, I can do it anyway. He immediately obeyed that trial judge, even though the trial judge went too far, I think, in trying to block the whole injunction. And he changed the order. In fact, changed it 2 more times until at least I thought it was constitutional. And then he respected every judge who blocked the order and properly went to the Supreme Court. And then won at the Supreme Court in a case called Hawaii versus Trump. It's not really the actions of someone who's this great danger to the Constitution. There have been past presidents who have said, well, that's the Supreme Court's decision, let them enforce it. That wasn't Trump. That was Andrew Jackson, one of maybe the first populist president in our country's history. And in fact, compare how President Trump approached this important question of constitutional change compared to his opponents. Again, his opponents want to expand the Supreme Court from 9 to 15 members. It's been 9 ever since just after the Civil War, because we have this tradition that we shouldn't try to just pack the courts whenever we don't like its decisions. FDR wanted to do this, and he was soundly defeated by his own party when he had an overwhelming majority in both houses of Congress. Now it's President Trump's opponents who want to repeat that effort to politicize the courts. President Trump actually has followed the traditional way we have sought to change the court's direction, which is just slow and gradual, but every time there's a vacancy, you get to appoint someone who represents your ideological approach, your jurisprudential school to the Supreme Court. Again, not the actions of someone who wants to tear down the Constitution, but actually someone who's acting within the traditional political traditions and constitutional practices that we've had for a century or more. So what is also the one last area, and then I do want to be respectful of the time, and we're almost coming up to 7:30, so I turn it over to questions and answers. I think this is, again, sounds negative, but I think there also has been a positive story for President Trump. Now, it's interesting, in the book, I make the case that actually Trump's presidency is a kind of a paradox, because what he's been doing, he has been making claims of presidential power. In domestic affairs, though, those claims have been done to reduce, not expand, the power of the presidency. You know, I could see other presidents during this epidemic saying, I have the right to open the economy, I have the right to close the economy. Trump hasn't done that. Actually, Trump has been very respectful of the federal division of authority between the national government and the state governments. He's respected that it really is the power of the states to decide to shut down their economies and to slowly reopen them, much to Trump's political detriment, I might add. He's been quite respectful of the constitutional system of checks and balances between the national and local governments. Where he has been, I think, active, and there are other areas in the domestic realm where he's also been using power to shrink government. The other area I point to would be deregulation. I think one of the great success stories, which is not much noted, is that not just tax cuts that really juiced the economy for the first 3 years of his presidency, but lifting red tape, pulling the government back. And the president's used his power to actually make the power of his office and that of the government as a whole smaller in order to provide more space, I think, for individual liberty and for the economy. But the area where he has been active has not been domestic affairs. It's been foreign affairs. But again, it's been characterized by this using power in a negative way, not a positive way. So usually the fights about our foreign policy, of which I've participated in, have been the president has an activist foreign policy. He wants to send troops somewhere. Does he have to get Congress's approval? I think not. I think Congress has a check on the president's power through the funding power, but there are a lot of people who think, oh no, there has to be a declaration of war. The Congress sets the policy, and then the president carries it out when we go to war, when we make treaties, and so on. I think that actually has things in foreign affairs backwards. I think Trump has shown that criticism of past presidents like George Bush, sometimes even Barack Obama, but usually levied against Republican presidents like Bush and Reagan, that criticism was empty. Because what Trump has done is he's used presidential power abroad to actually restore American sovereignty and to pull back from perhaps over-engagement abroad. So he has withdrawn US troops from Syria. He's withdrawn troops from Iraq. He's talking about withdrawing troops from Afghanistan. He's lowering the troop presence in Germany. He's threatened to pull back from Japan and South Korea too. That wouldn't be possible, actually, if president's critics had been right, because why doesn't Congress get to decide where all the troops get to go? And then the president carries it out. But actually, by withdrawing these troops with the public support, Trump has shown that actually the president all along had that constitutional power over deployments. It's also true of foreign policy. Think about what President Trump has been doing with agreements. He's terminated the Iran nuclear deal. He's terminated the Paris Accords on global warming. He terminated the Trans-Pacific Partnership on Trade. He's terminated 2 arms control agreements, the INF agreement and the Open Skies agreements with Russia. Again, if this were really a world where Congress should be setting the policies and the president just carries them out, how can the president right, pull the US out of all these agreements so that we aren't overcommitted around the world. Again, I think it shows that the president here, President Trump here, has been restoring and defending the president's traditional powers in foreign affairs, and he's using them to readjust our commitments abroad with our resources, and shows all along that it really is the president who is the leading role, plays the leading role in foreign affairs, not Congress. So just coming to the end of the time, one thing I would throw out is, what does this mean for the president's possible second term? A lot of what I've described is President Trump using the Constitution as a shield domestically to fight off the independent counsel, to fight off impeachment. He's been using it more actively in foreign affairs, but actually in a way to, again, sort of husband our resources and bring our means and ends of foreign policy into greater balance. What does this mean in terms of what he might do in a second term? I'd be curious to hear what all of you think. I happen to think one thing is that he will probably continue his fight against the bureaucracy. And this depends, and this was actually the book I came and talked to you about a few years ago. It was called Crisis in Command. And one thing I argued there was that at certain points in our history, and these points have been Jefferson's administration, Jackson, Lincoln, FDR, and Reagan are widely considered these turning points in our history. The government becomes old, antiquated, slow, encrusted. It no longer fits the times within which it sits. You have great problems that confront the country that this government can't handle, like as Keone mentioned, the Civil War in Lincoln. You have times when the economy grows so quickly, it nationalizes, and the government can't keep up. I think that's what's happening now in a way. We have a bureaucracy that was built for the 1930s to 1950s, back in the day where GM and the making of cars consumed a huge part of our economy. It's almost funny to remember the phrase, or what's good for GM is good for the country. Maybe that should, Elon Musk will say what's good for Tesla is good for the country sooner or later. But we had a time when the economy was dominated by large nationwide employers, large unions, where the main way of making things was to bring everybody together to factories where you would make things in assembly lines and then you would send the products out. And the government, if you look at it, is organized along the same lines. Well, that's not the economy we have anymore. And maybe what you've seen in these attacks on Trump from the bureaucracy are maybe the beginnings of the death throes of this kind of, I think, antiquated government that we have. And we're going to have to renovate it so that we have a faster, smaller, more lithe government that's more suited to this kind of information age economy that we have today. And I think that's really what would be, when we go back and look at it, what will be the dominant mission of President Trump's second term, will be to continue to fight this permanent bureaucracy and to reshape it so that it actually fits more in with what the American people need rather than what the bureaucracy needs or what special interest groups need. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much again for inviting me to join you. Unlike last time, we were not interrupted by strange people in orange outfits bursting forward at random moments to try to interrupt the talks. So this has been the most peaceful forum that I've had with you before in the last 10 years. So I look forward to all of your questions and comments, and thank you very much for bearing with me.
Thank you, John. To hear your virtual claps and applause, I'm sure you're getting through the ether right now. And just as you mentioned, the flash mob that you were the subject of, our historian and immediate past President Joel Fine has been in the background, and he reminded us that it was actually 2011. So it's been 9 years. So you're pretty close as to the last time you spoke to us. And I wonder where those flash mobbers are now. Man, they're 9 years older too. So let's see what happened to them. Okay, so we have a bunch of really great questions. Thanks all you people out there, liberty lovers out there, that are sending those in. And we'll first start out with a little the personal. Someone would like to know how you transitioned from being part of the Bush 43 administration to ended up being a law professor at UC Berkeley.
I get asked that a lot. So
I figured you know the answers.
I like to say I feel like sometimes I'm the West Berlin out here. I'm a shining beacon of democracy and capitalism surrounded by a sea of Marxists. But one thing that, has struck me is, as a conservative, you're always certainly in the minority here at Berkeley. And I used to, it was like kind of being in a zoo, watching, life at the zoo, but it was still a zoo and it was contained. But now, looking at what's going on around the country, I kind of feel like Berkeley is coming and visiting everybody's cities now. And I'm afraid a lot of the rhetoric you hear and a lot of the protest tactics you see are things that have been going on in Berkeley for the whole time I've been here. So now you're all in it too.
That's a great visual image. I just said outside your office, you should have a sign that says you are now leaving the American sector. That might just there. Well, of course, there are a couple of comments on the upcoming election. What a surprise. And a good one that came across is, or if you have any insight to this, is the preparation of the Trump's legal team is what happens if things go wonky, specifically ballots coming in late, and our personal favorite, I think the Norm Coleman race, when there were more ballots than registered voters in a precinct. Do you have any insights on how the Trump administration and the legal team specifically is preparing for November 3rd and 4th and 5th and 6th, probably?
Yeah, actually, a lot of you probably remember Florida 2000,
Sure.
sort of when I got involved in, sort of being a broader commenter about policy and politics. I actually had the pleasure of going down to Tallahassee and testifying before the Florida legislature, because I was one of the few people back then who was interested in the Supreme Court reviewing what states did, which became the constitutional issue that settled the election. If you think Florida 2000 was bad, think about the possibility of that happening in multiple states this time. I think the odds are quite high. If the election is close, and then you have a few battleground states where the vote tally is close. Remember, within Florida, it was under 2% difference. You start having a recount. Well, suppose that happens in more than one state, right? This election could be just as close or even closer than it was in 2000. And as you mentioned, Erica, then you have mail-in voting, you have the potential for abuse, you have potential for fraud, you have COVID interfering. Suppose more than one state in these battleground states doesn't get their vote done on time. Then they start to have recounts. And then, like as in Florida, how are those recounts going to be done? Are they going to apply the right standard to counting what's a valid mail-in ballot? Was there the right signature? Were the ballots punched properly? You might remember that in the end, the reason the Supreme Court stopped Florida's recount back in 2000 was because it found that these different counties were all applying different standards to what was a vote or not. So think about if that happens in more than just Palm Beach County, Florida this time. So what I think could possibly happen is that you could have, like in Florida, litigation from both the Trump and the Biden sides over recounts that are being done with strange standards, suspect standards, political standards. And what that raises, as it did in 2000, is the possibility that some states might not get their electoral votes in on time. This year, I think the states have to get their electoral votes in by December 14th. And if they don't, it's possible that you have states which don't get any electoral votes in at all. And if that happens and nobody gets a majority, then the Constitution throws the election into the House of Representatives and the Senate, and the Electoral College no longer functions. So we could talk about more about that, about what happens. But again, remember in 2000, if the Supreme Court had not intervened and stopped Florida from recounting, it's quite possible that Florida never would have sent any Electoral College votes in to Washington, and then it would have gone into Congress. And that could happen in multiple states this time.
Perhaps, and maybe there's no way of knowing this, I have to think that the Trump team is prepared. But who knows, they're probably preparing for a variety of scenarios. And there was kind of, everyone has to sort of make it up as they go along as well, I would imagine.
Well, what I would do if I was on their legal team, I would reason backwards from the result. So if the election were held today with the current Congress, which it wouldn't be, it would be the future Congress elected in November. If it was this current Congress, then if the election got thrown into Congress, President Trump would win. And I'd be happy to explain how that would work, later. But if that's true, then that actually gives the Trump side more of an advantage when it comes time to fighting all of these state-by-state recounts that could occur. Because if you think about it, all Trump has to do to win is just to say, well, I'm not going to let you guys get away with handing in what I think are fraudulent electoral votes. It's fine with me if Florida or Ohio or Pennsylvania doesn't hand in any electoral votes, because once that happens, I'm going to win if it gets to Congress. It's actually the Biden side that's at a disadvantage, I think, in the legal fight, because Trump only has to fight a delaying action. I don't know if they have thought it through that way, but I think that's actually the reality of it. Just like in 2000, if you recall, the Republicans had held both majorities in both the House and the Senate. If Florida had never gotten their electoral votes in 2000, Bush would have won under the Constitution's rules, because the election would have gone to Congress.
Yeah, lots of drips and drabs, I'm sure. And sort of related to the election and the run-up to it, got a great question about a subject that kind of ebbs and flows and bubbles up and then goes away, and that's the Durham Report. Any insight of, will it first be released before the election? And will there be any indictments? And the subheading of this caller said, by the way, we know that you know. So someone thinks you know this, John. So
if I knew, I would have to go to jail.
Oh, well, we don't want
because
that.
It's being done by a grand jury, and it's illegal to get leaks out of a grand jury. But seriously, a lot of people, I think, expected the Durham investigation to be completed by around now, because the idea was that, and for those of you who don't remember, Durham is conducting an investigation into the origins of the Russia collusion investigation and whether there were any laws violated by everyone down from the most junior attorney all the way up to the top in the investigation into the Trump campaign, which we now know was groundless. So we saw before Labor Day the pleading out of a young attorney who named Kleinsmith, who you may remember from the reports, had altered the information that ultimately reached the courts to grant a warrant to surveil Carter Page and the Trump campaign. Now, to me, it seems a junior attorney like that would not have done that by himself. It would be actually crazy for someone like that to think, oh, I will monkey around with the CIA and the FBI so that we can do what I always thought was the red line for what you can't do, which is to use the vast powers of the government to investigate and surveil the presidential candidate of the opposition party. I think that was the whole FISA law, and all of that was based on this idea that Nixon had crossed that red line, and we should never allow that to happen again. And yet here we go. In 2016, the FBI was doing it again. I have a really hard time believing some very, very junior attorney at the FBI decided to do that all by himself. And so I do think that Durham is trying to bring his investigation to a close, and that was just the beginning of what you're going to see are, him, which is what you're supposed to do, is going up the food chain. However, we're getting very close to the election, and Durham, if he's acting like a normal Justice Department prosecutor, doesn't want to be the position that Comey was in 2016 and releasing information right before the election and perhaps influencing it. So I tend to think if he's going to get his job done, he's got to get it done in the next 2 to 3 weeks. He's got to get it done in September. Otherwise, it's too close to the election.
Right, right. And sort of related to that question, I think this listener speaks for a lot of us. For those of us who are laymen and political neophytes, Uh, why does it seem to take so long when there's obvious leaks by Congress and people in the administration, and the wheels of justice turn so slowly? Is it, does no one really care? Or is just the bureaucracy so lengthy? Why does it seem to take so long when there's an obvious leak?
Why are these the Durham investigation and these other investigations?
No, right. It
Yeah,
takes so long.
actually, these kinds of investigations go on for years usually, and so if Durham was appointed by Attorney General Barr, or just right before Barr, and then Barr expanded it. But this is, if you remember, this is really going on. It's so hard to remember. It seems like so long ago, but this was really just early 2018. If you remember the Mueller report coming out and everything, this is really early 2018. And so Durham's really been only at it he's been at it for maybe a year and just under a year and a half, maybe. So this is actually extremely fast for criminal investigations. Usually very complicated criminal investigations can go on for multiple years, sometimes like 5-6 years. So I think actually he's trying to do it quick. Also, the other thing is, I would get the sense that a lot of the people who are being investigated are probably being extremely uncooperative. These are people, if you're talking about investigating FBI officers who are not accustomed to being under investigation. They're the ones who like to do the investigating. And I'm sure they are raising every constitutional right they have to delay the investigation and to slow things down and to fight over the terms of their interviews and so on. And hopefully maybe to drag it past the election. I mean, that's what I would do if I were in their position. And I'm sure that's what they're doing. So I actually think Durham, even by getting the first conviction before Labor Day, was actually proceeding pretty quickly.
Oh, that's good to know. Okay, we'll jump away from the election. I'm sure we'll come back in a few minutes, but to get a little variety here, this next question deals with both COVID and the riots. And if you could comment, although the answer is pretty obvious, that if we look around the right for peaceable assembly when there are protests against the COVID lockdowns or religious assemblies, those are very well enforced, but rioting is not. What can we do about that?
Oh, I do think, looking at what some of these mayors have been doing, that they've been engaged in a violation of the First Amendment. So as you say, Erica, there's a right to assemble. There's a right to petition the government. There's a right to speak. And now the government can always place reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions on that. You can't, for example, protest in someone's neighborhood at 3 a.m. But what the government can't do, and the Supreme Court has reaffirmed this time and time again, so what these mayors can't do is they can't say, I agree with you, so I'm going to let you protest, and I disagree with you, so I'm going to shut you down. Or I don't like your religious observances, I'm shutting you down, but I like them to protest outside. The last thing the government is allowed to do is to pick and choose amongst viewpoints, about the content of the speech, and suppress some and allow others. And
yet it seems that that's what's happening.
And I'm afraid that's what we're seeing when people say, okay, you can't have religious services, but you can have a protest outside. Or you can't have a protest when it's against the lockdown itself, but you can have a Black Lives Matter protest. I think the facts seem pretty clear to me that mayors are using their power through the police to try to give a hard time to protesters they don't like and to allow protests they do like. And I think that's a flat violation of the free speech clause of the Constitution. I think people can
sue. Does somebody have to overtly sue? Is that how?
Yeah, I think people should sue. Yeah, I think people can sue. In fact, even though the lawsuits in the end were unsuccessful out here in California, right? The people sued right away about cities and ultimately the state shutting down religious services. And even though the lower courts rejected that claim, it put so much pressure, pointed out the hypocrisy of the policy so clearly that the state and at least many counties gave way and allowed religious services because of it. And I would say people should also sue if they find that their protests on political issues, like, for example, against the epidemic lockdowns, are being limited by the government when it then turns around and says, well, but if it's a Black Lives Matter protest, please feel free to go ahead.
Right, right. Okay, then the next question, and it's nothing to do with constitutionality, but it's interesting and it's international. China, Russia, which is the bigger enemy?
Oh, I think that's pretty easy, actually. I think China is the longer term enemy. You know, Russia is a short-term rival. I mean, further, they're not, both of them not outright enemies, at least I hope not yet, but they're rivals and they're not friendly. But China, if you just look, you know, if you're I'm a realist, as I tend to be, I tend to think of myself about foreign policy. What you do is you look at the national power that opponents or rivals can bring to bear. And that's, in the end, a function of population and economy. And China, if you look at they're larger than us in population, their economy is second in the world behind us now, and they're catching up fast. And then you look at their intentions, and you look at what China's doing to the Uyghurs in their own country, you look at what they've done to Hong Kong, you look at what they're doing to the South China Sea. I once looked, and you know, there used to be this myth that China was a peaceful country. They've actually gone to war with most of their neighbors. India, they've had wars with Russia, India, Vietnam. They were killing Americans in the Korean War in the 1950s. Right? I mean, there were actual Chinese and American troops. So I think it is a myth that the Chinese Communist Party is somehow this peaceful institution, and the United States is interfering with its rightful rise in the world. So I think if you look at the capabilities and then intentions, China is clearly the long-term national security threat to us for, I think, the foreseeable future. Russia has the intentions, if they could, but their capabilities are rapidly declining. You know, they're a country whose average life expectancy has been falling ever since the end of the Cold War. They have nuclear weapons. They don't have a military that can project power around the world as they used to. They're mostly a threat to Europe. And so this goes to a point I think that President Trump has been quite right about, has been to try to force the Europeans to bear a fair share of their own defense. And if they're the ones who, if they're the ones who think we've been too soft on Russia, well, then they can be tougher on Russia, and they should be tougher on Russia. They're actually the ones who are more at threat from Russia than we are.
And sort of related to China, at least in my mind, do you have a comment on whether or not we should support the WHO, and to what regard, and to what extent, I should say?
Yeah, I should have said one of the things I was trying to do in my book was try to figure out what was the real theme of Trump's foreign policy. And to me, it's a return to a reliance on nation states and their sovereignty, which is their control of their own borders, their own populations, and a reliance on nations to drive world politics. And if that's true, then what President Trump should do and has been doing has been to downplay or de-relegate these international institutions like the WHO that somehow think they're more important than the nation states. And I think the COVID epidemic pulled aside the curtains and showed what was really going on, which was what happened. Why did the WHO, I think, fail to spread the word, to identify the serious nature of the epidemic and then to quickly identify the measures needed to be taken to stop its spread? It's because it had been corrupted by China. Right? China spent a lot of money to get their favorite candidate to become head of the WHO. And this guy was the one who made, and the WHO made the decisions to not label the spread of this, not label this coronavirus the serious health threat it was right away, and then not to call for a lockdown in travel. And so I think what President Trump is doing is, right, by saying we're going to pull out of things like the WHO, we're going to pull out things like the Paris Accords, is to return us to, I think, a more sensible way of foreign policy is not to trust international bodies to solve our problems for us, but to rely on nations dealing with other nations to figure out solutions. And sometimes that's going to require us to be coercive or to apply pressure or to sanction or to retaliate when countries like China don't live up to our expectations. But we shouldn't expect bodies like the WHO or the UN to solve our problems for us. I think that actually produces kind of utopian naivete in our foreign policy. Now in some ways, we're suffering for that.
Right, right. On the subject of executive orders and DACA specifically, can you speculate on the impact of the DACA decision or non-decision?
Yes. So this is something, so I was in the press over the summer because I wrote a piece about DACA, and President Trump called me to talk about it. He was such a fan of the piece, I suppose. But I'll tell you what I said in the piece, which was, if you remember, DACA was President Obama's declaration that even though the immigration laws required the removal from the country of people who came here illegally, that he would suspend those laws because he didn't agree with the policy. Now, I tend to think that these people who were brought here as children through no fault of their own in violation of the immigration laws, that there should be some system to allowing them to stay if they join the armed forces or they're in school, that decision is up to Congress. And Congress so far has chosen not to grant some special exception to these dreamers. And so until then, the president has to, again, as I said earlier, take care that the laws are faithfully executed. President Obama, I think, defaulted on his constitutional responsibilities when he said, well, I'm just not going to apply that law in DACA, and then in DAPA, just 2 years later, to their parents. So President Trump comes along, and I think rightly says, what President Obama is doing is unconstitutional. I'm ordering a stop to it. That seems quite simple. President Obama said, I'm going to do it. President Trump has the right to come in and say, nope, let's restore law enforcement to the levels it was before. The thing that I found shocking was that the Supreme Court came in just this summer with a decision, actually sued by my university, by the regents of the University of California. The Supreme Court said, no, President Trump, you have to still keep doing that, even though you think it's unconstitutional. I think that is an unprecedented seizure of constitutional power by the Supreme Court to say that presidents aren't allowed to interpret the Constitution. Presidents aren't allowed to stop the government from doing things he thinks are unconstitutional. The president takes the same oath as the Supreme Court to support and defend the Constitution. The Supreme Court, I do not think, is superior to the other two branches in deciding what's constitutional. Nevertheless, so I read that decision, and I said, well, if that's true, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. That means President Trump can say, well, let's search or replace immigration or replace it with taxes. And now I'm not going to enforce a tax law. And if the next president thinks it's unconstitutional, it's going to take him 4 years to undo it, just like it's taken President Trump 4 years or more to undo DACA. I think that's the part President Trump loved, Erica. He loved the idea of, oh, I could do a tax cut all by myself. And actually, I thought the case was better, actually, for Trump. As I said, I thought, you could say, look, I'm going to suspend tax collection. We're in the middle of the biggest economic contraction since the Great Depression. The economy has fallen in just 3 months as fast as it did. It took 4 years for it to fall in the Great Depression. I think the government has better things to do than chase every low-income and middle-income person around trying to collect all their taxes. It's not a good use of federal resources. It's exactly what President Obama said with the immigration laws, but without the emergency circumstances of a Great Depression. So President Trump called, he said, I love this article. Tell me about it. So I talked to him about it and described how I think it worked. And then you saw that just a few weeks ago, he proposed, and not just proposes, executing a suspension of the payroll tax. So I say, good for him. Teach the Supreme Court a lesson. If they're going to say President Obama could do something, then I don't see why President Trump can't do the exact same thing.
Yeah, that's great. Now we feel we're justified in doing that. Well, we've danced around non-election questions for a few minutes here, but there's just no getting around it. There's just where all the interest is right now. So we'll do a few more on that. How do you feel about election integrity? We know we talked about the problems, but just what would happen if there's too many people and the polls close or it rains that day. But what about out and out fraud? Do you think that's...
Well, I worried about it because of the unprecedented conditions we're in. You have the epidemic. You have some states going to complete mail-in voting. You have all kinds of inconsistent standards about mail-in voting. So you have some states which say the ballot has to be in by election day. You have some states which say it has to be postmarked by election day. You are inevitably going to have fighting about how those ballots are going to count. And this year it's going to make so past years, it may not have made as big a difference because there weren't that many absentee ballots and the elections weren't that close. But now it seems like the election is going to be very close. It's going to be decided by a few states. And I saw polls out today. This is that claim that Biden and Trump in a lot of these states are within the margin of error of the polling now. It could be that these absentee ballots now make the difference. If they do, we are really going to have to pay attention in a way we really didn't have to before, except in congressional races, but it hasn't made a difference at the presidential level before about how states are running their mail-in balloting. So as you say, Erica, of course, there's potential for abuse, there's potential for fraud, there's possibility of mistakes. And I think that's, we just have never had to deal with it before. So I'm worried. I think everybody should be worried.
And I think those of us in California, especially, if there was it 2 years ago, I think it was, where there were maybe 10 or 12 Congress people that were ahead, Republicans, on election day, and darn it all, there was a recount, or here's some more ballots, and it was 10 out of 10. And those of us with a mathematical background, that really does boggle the mind that they all went in one direction. So I think we're also burning a little bit about that. But getting back to one of your earlier comments tonight, is that you mentioned you did not vote for Donald Trump the first time, but likely will this time. Just as you're out and about, do you think there are many people in your category that, even if they're silent now, that there's a feeling of not last time, but yeah, okay, we'll try it this time?
Well, I have to say, since I live in California, my vote really makes no difference at all. So, but my mom lives in Pennsylvania, which is where I'm from. And so her vote's like 1,000 times more important than my vote. Of course, because of our electoral college system, which I think the founders wisely included to prevent our presidential system from becoming just a single, majority, 51.1% of the country just gets to pick the president and do what, and then they do what they want for 4 years. It really does depend on what's going to happen in the battleground states. And those 5 or 6 states are important because the electoral college makes them important. And it's good that the electoral college makes them important because it forces presidents not just to campaign in the top 10 cities by population of the country, but to form coalitions throughout the country involving different regions and to assemble different states to get to 270 electoral votes. I'm sorry. I was so busy talking about my mom. I lost the thread of your
Are you aware of
other about my mom voting in Pennsylvania? Sorry.
Well, John, I think the question was, are you aware of others who were not Trump supporters in 16, but maybe have changed? And if you can't name names, that's fine. But do you know of any?
Oh yeah, of course. Actually, one thing that I've been struck by is that I think Trump may well do better amongst minority groups than he did last time. Actually, some of the things I found very surprising, I might think about writing about it next time for my next book, is Asians, for example, wildly supportive of Hillary Clinton. Even though to me, Asians ought to be voting for the party that's in favor of smaller government, for less regulation of small business, for tax cuts, the party that's against affirmative action, which is probably the most important thing for most Asian families. And yet I think that when I looked at the polling data from 2016, Asians were the second largest demographic group after African Americans to vote Democrat. So they voted Democrat more than Hispanics, single moms, all those groups that are supposedly part of this new Democratic coalition. So I do think that more Asians will vote for Trump this time because I think they come to realize that the policies he's promoted these last 4 years are more in line with what I think are in the interests of Asians.
We do have a question about the Department of Defense sending billions of dollars to universities, Berkeley in particular, which this person describes as funding anti-American activities on campus. Do we have a chance of stopping such a thing?
So I don't know about, it's not necessarily the Defense Department, I would say, but there is this issue, the broader issue I think that the question is aiming at is what's happening with free speech on our campuses. And I do think that President Trump signed an executive order that threatened to cut off funds to any university receiving funds from the federal government, of course, that engages in suppression of free speech. I think that's a great start and an important start, because I do think that's one thing I've noticed over my time teaching here at Berkeley, but I don't think it's just Berkeley. I think actually all the top universities are like Berkeley now. I do see less and less conservatives being hired for jobs. I do see more and more harassment of conservative students and conservative speakers. You see all the accounts from a lot of colleges where professors are being threatened with expulsion, being fired, suspended for expressing their, taking advantage of their right to express their views. And I worry that that's the thing that I think really makes America great and makes our universities great, is the unrestricted right of free debate and inquiry. And I do see that under threat now in our universities. So I think it's a positive that the administration has said, if you universities keep that up, we're just going to take away your federal funding. I don't think any major national university can operate without federal funds nowadays. So I hope in a Trump second term that the administration will start to enforce that more seriously and try to bring under control, I think, this cancel culture that is spreading so quickly, not just in our universities now, but now it's spreading beyond them.
John, speaking of that, I'm personally really curious about who you're speaking to. I'm sitting here listening to you thinking, God, wouldn't it be great to be a law student in your class? And I'm so glad Berkeley has you. They're very lucky. But are they prepared, or do they have any real understanding of the preciousness of the Constitution as you teach it?
So I have noticed over the years that less and less of the graduate students, look, at Berkeley, we're getting, I think, the top 1% of the graduate students in the country. And I don't think they know as much history as the students I saw when I started 25 years ago. I think I'd say, if I was roughly estimating, I'd say probably half the class knows what the New Deal is pretty well. I don't think a lot of students really are up on Reconstruction, and there's very, very little knowledge, I think, about the founders. Someone once joked, but it wasn't a joke, that you could graduate from every Ivy League college without having read the Federalist Papers, the Bible, or Shakespeare. And I think that's only more so the case now than it was when someone said that 30, 40 years ago. And so I try to teach the Constitution in its historical context and try to explain how the founders made their choices. But to do that, you have to understand the history of the founding. And I worry that more people these days just tend to think of the Constitution as this tool of oppression that you hear spread by things like the New York Times' 1619 Project and places like Black Lives Matter, which think that the Constitution in American society just contains structural racism. I actually think the Constitution is an amazing document and is, I think, has contributed much to the success of the United States. And I just say, look at all the countries look at the America's peer countries in Europe and Asia. Look at the terrible things that they have done to themselves over the last 100 years. The tens of millions of people that have been killed in Asia and Europe by their own governments because they thought they were doing the latest thing, that they probably looked at our Constitution as old, slow, and boring, and they had the latest theories of government. Well, look at all the trouble it got them into. So I often, one way to think of this, I always say, yeah, the United States is like Forrest Gump. We're sort of simple and plodding and slow, but we're also less taken by these radical shifts from communism to monarchy to fascism, back and forth, all these wild things that Europeans and our Asian competitors have put themselves through, much to our benefit. I think the Constitution is a big part of that.
If you listen to the Democrats, not necessarily in the government, but the media, there's no way a Trump reelection will be accepted. What does that look like? What does that look like?
So I see accounts and threats of this happening. I tend not to take them maybe as seriously as other people do. But that's because I expect the constitutional rules will be followed. And there actually is a process in the Constitution for all of these possibilities, that the state doesn't get its vote in on time, that it goes to the House. Maybe the House is split. How does it turn out? There's actually a train of procedures in the Constitution and its amendments that go through all these different hypothetical situations. So for people to not accept the result of the constitutional system is, I think, self-defeating. I think that's, if the Democratic Party say Trump wins and they refuse to accept the result, they're going to essentially say, well, we refuse to obey the Constitution. And I think that's a much more dangerous and long-term threat than just whoever happens to occupy the Oval Office for the next 4 years. If you just say we refuse to accept the way and that's my point in a way, is that it's really Trump who's the one I expect will follow the constitutional rules and accept the outcome of the Constitution. It's really his attackers who are threatening to overturn a system that has stood the United States very well for the last more than 220 years. But what would it look like? Well, I guess you could say in some states might say, well, we refuse to hand in electoral votes because we think Trump stole the election. I suppose that could, but see, that my point is the Constitution provides for that because the founders understood that. Actually, the founders were much more worried about the stability of the country than we have been, because we've been lucky not to have to live through all these possibilities. But they actually thought about, what if some states want to bring down the federal government, so they refuse to actually do the election? Well, then the founders said, well, then it goes into the House, and the House picks the president, but they only pick by delegation. They don't pick by majority vote. They vote by state. Each state delegation gets one vote in the House. So California and Delaware will both have one vote when it comes time to pick the president if the Electoral College fails. And then if the Democrats want to be in the position of saying, well, yes, that's in the Constitution, but we just don't accept it anyway, well, then they're putting themselves in the position of groups in the past have warred with the Constitution, and those people have always lost. I think that at that point you start to lose. You'll lose the trust of the American people if you just say we just refuse to accept the Constitution. That's the same argument that the segregationists made in the South. That's the same argument that people who tried to secede during the Civil War made. And I think it's better to be on the winning side, is to be on the side of following the Constitution, accepting the outcome no matter whether you agree with it or not.
Yeah, so there more craziness that could be in store, but they don't have the legal standing, so that's good to know. Okay, maybe one more. Or the evening would not be complete without talking about the media in Silicon Valley and high tech, and what you can and can't say in Google and Twitter, et cetera, et cetera. Take that wherever you'd like to, John.
Well, it's interesting. I think conservatives or libertarians have a hard time with social media, because I think it's undeniable now that social media companies like Twitter are starting to impose discriminatory restrictions based on viewpoint of different speakers. It does seem to be affecting conservatives much more heavily. It's affecting conservatives much more heavily than liberals. On the other hand, conservatives and libertarians have long taken the position that the government is under the restrictions of the free speech clause, but not private actors. And so corporations don't have to follow the free speech clause if they don't feel like it. You don't have to offer up your house or your business as a forum for people to speak. You can support whatever speech you want to on your private property. So the issue is that going to change in some way because of the great power that we're now seeing wielded by Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Twitter, Facebook, and so on? I don't think that the solution will come about from saying that we should apply the constitutional restrictions on government to those companies. I think that's a mistake. So instead, I think the way it gets solved is through forcing those companies to play fairly in the marketplace, making sure they're not cheating, they're not violating antitrust laws or other laws. And then I think as we've learned in the past, expecting the market to provide a place for competition, that if these companies continue to discriminate based on people's views and ideas, then other companies will arise and push them aside. I might remember, you were all in Silicon Valley. I've been in the area too. You might remember Google was not the biggest search engine in the beginning. It was Yahoo. And you might remember before Facebook, there was something called MySpace. Right? There were competitors that before these, and I think one thing about technology, maybe I'm naive about this, but I think that it's easier for competitors to enter into this world and challenge these titans now than it was back in the day of the large railroad companies and auto companies and steel companies, where you had to invest in huge plants and networks, to manufacturing networks, to compete with a GM, say, or US Steel. Now, I think if you have an idea and access to the internet, if you're a better competitor, maybe Twitter's not going to be long for the world if they keep discriminating against conservatives. So I have great faith that the marketplace, if it's allowed to operate properly, will constrain these companies in the end.